Alors l'horizon de ces nouvelles façons de travailler se joue beaucoup aujourd'hui dans une manière de redéfinir.
So this new horizon in this new work organization, redefining the work arrangements and the risk exposure of teleworkers. We're going to talk about that with two representatives from social partners who are at work trying to help us understand this phenomena and also to lay the foundation for a future European framework. Rebekah Smith, to start with, a Deputy Director in the Social Affairs Department for Business Europe. Can you hear us? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. And Aude, CEFALLIELO, a researcher at the European Trade Union Institute, ETUI. Can you hear us, Aude? Yes, good morning. I can hear you perfectly.
For all of us, for this debate, you can also, of course, vous pouvez bien sûr continuer à poser vos questions. You can also have some questions to Aude and to Rebekah. We will share them at the end of this sequence. Aude, I would like to start with you on which aspect did that pandemic and the booming of the telework underline, I would say, problematics, inequalities for workers that were surely known before, but that, as you said when we spoke about it, they kind of slashed in the face with the pandemic.
Yes, thank you for your question. So before focusing on telework, I think it's important to remember that the pandemic was either a slap in the face or quite of a eye-opening event on existing risk or problematic management of occupational hazards in some sectors. And here we'll briefly, because I know we don't have a lot of time, focus on three categories of workers. Just a few words on the frontline workers, essential workers, and then teleworkers. The frontline workers who worked in the hospital, who were in contact with the patient who had COVID. Usually it was in hospitals. And what happened is, for years, this workforce have been suffering, their health have been suffering from the cut of resources in the sector. And so basically when the pandemic arrived, that was already on a physically and emotionally and psychologically tired workforce. And then the pandemic arrived on top, and it was an extra challenge. But the problem was the risk they were facing before has not been managed properly. When it comes to the essential workers, just two examples. So this is the workers who are not confronted with the patient who had COVID, but still were required to do their work on location to allow the society to function. So we really need them, essentials. First case, mid-sector Germany. The fact is, for years, this sector, the workers have been exposed to precarious and bad working conditions. But when the pandemic arrived, that created the perfect ground for clusters. And then that raised the public attention on what happened in these sectors. And now we address the working condition altogether. Once again, pandemic, eye-opening. Platform work, the fact that they are considered as self-employed, there is a legal expectation that they are going to prevent their own health and safety. But the way the platform is organized, they don't have the organizational means to do it. Once again, public attention has been set on it because of the pandemic, but it has been an overall problem. It just brought it to the surface. And then telework. So for the people who could do the work at home, remotely, first of all, telework in this context was seen as a preventive measure against the exposure to COVID, which is different from what we're facing now. And the thing is, because of this, because it was rushed, all the assessment of the risk that have been known about telework for like 20 years now, like the workstation, the isolation, the problem of like the blurred line on working time, that has been assessed properly, that hasn't been an object of consultation at the workplace. And we skipped a bit the step. And also because we only have a framework agreement, there have been discrepancy and disparities about how companies handled it, because it wasn't often said exactly what legally was required to talk about and to cover. So that created inequalities when we were forced to telework. It existed, it just impacted way more workers because of the mandatory telework.
You did a lot of position paper during the crisis valuing these inequalities. Gender inequalities is also a big issue you valued actually in teleworking, of course, and we spoke about it with EFALLIELO because it's in the data of Eurofund. Rebekah, do you share these constatations that Aude had about the fact that this teleworking massification is also a risk to massify some inequalities within, and what kind of lessons do you have yourself out of this massification of telework?
Sure, I think where I completely agree with Aude is, of course, we need to remember that not all jobs are teleworkable, if we can use that word. So, of course, during the pandemic, there were many people that were still at work and keeping the economy going, keeping our societies going, providing extremely important services, not only in the healthcare sector, but also in terms of transport, in terms of other essential services within the supply chains. And of course, we have to think here of the workers in those sectors, but also the companies as well that had to keep working in very difficult circumstances. But I think, specifically on the issue of telework, of course, we see that different companies and different workers had different experiences. So it's very difficult to generalize on this issue because it depends on the systems that were set up by the companies, but also on the individual experience of the workers. Of course, we all know some people prefer to work autonomously. Some people were quite pleased to be having more flexibility to work from home or elsewhere. Some people have more challenges in terms of issues around isolation or not being part of a team. So whereas, of course, we need collective approaches, and that's something that we're very conscious of and something that we develop as social partners. But we also have to bear in mind that there were many different experiences with telework. I think the other thing to bear in mind, and I'm sure we'll come to that issue later this morning, but in terms of what can be done by social partners, I think we have to bear in mind that the COVID situation was a very extraordinary one, particularly when it comes to telework, because workers were forced to telework and employers were forced, if you like, to send their workers home in a way, because of the pandemic, that's completely normal. But that's not the normal situation for teleworking or remote working, where often it is a request of the worker to have more flexibility, or it can also be, of course, a jointly agreed way of working between the employer and the worker. So, of course, whatever we do in the future, we need to bear this in mind, that we've been in a very unusual situation, and that's not the normal practice for telework, which is, of course, voluntary normally.
And for the future and the present situation, it's negotiating, trying to define a new frame of work between employers and employees. How many days telework a week? Which condition to telework? Who's going to pay for what? We saw about all these issues just before. There's a lot of negotiations ongoing. There's also this European Social Partners Agreement on telework existing for 20 years on, actually. Do you think now it needs to be refreshed or reviewed, and the fact that a lot of negotiation overpass this agreement also implies that it has to be maybe reviewed, or just let the collective negotiations do the job and keep the agreement like it is as a minimum standard, if I could say?
Yeah, I think in general, what we see, and we've seen that from the other presentation this morning, there's different approaches at national levels. In some cases, it's been left to the social partners to really devise collective agreements, whether that's at national, sectoral, company level around telework. In some cases, it's been more through legislation with collaboration of the social partners or not. But I think for us, I give a kind of spoiler alert, I think what we are discussing jointly as social partners at the moment is how to revise the telework agreement. I mean, we're not at that stage yet because, of course, we need to both get mandates from our membership on that issue. But I think we do recognise that whilst there are many elements of the telework agreement that are still very valid, that there are some issues there that we probably need to look into again, as you said, after 20 years. Of course, the COVID situation has made a big difference, but there were developments in telework before that, I think, as well. So I think what is clear is that some of the aspects of that agreement are still very, very relevant. What I mentioned before about the voluntary nature of telework, but also the fact that we made it very clear in that agreement that workers have the same rights when they're teleworking, whether it's rights to training in terms of working time, etc. So there are some aspects that are still very much valid, but we will have to see how we can find a new agreement on this, taking into account, of course, the workers' needs, but also the employers and the managers' needs, because I think one of the aspects that we haven't looked into so much yet is the challenges for managers to manage teams working from home, to manage people that are working more autonomously, because I think this is an issue for line managers in particular, but also for the employer as a whole. How do you ensure that you're giving people that flexibility that they want, but at the same time that people are working productively, that you know what they're doing, and of course there's always a balance to be found here. So I guess these are the kind of issues that will be at the centre of our negotiations, even when we have a mandate. I just put that caveat there because it's important.
Aude, I would like to relay one question coming from the audience, which is really can be follow what just Rebekah said. What European regulation text employees representing can use to support a social dialogue in the enterprises on this telework issues? We spoke about the social agreement from 2002. Are there other materials possible to nourish and support the social dialogue from the employees' point of view?
Yes, but also I would like to react to one thing that Rebekah said. Individual preferences should not prevent a collective organization. And we can still have rules within companies respecting individual preferences and the fact that this is voluntary. So yeah, just as a precision on our side. Also, I think, so we have this telework agreement for more than 20 years now. And the problem is we show in the implementation report published by the Commission in 2008 that it has been implemented in a really different ways, because this is a non-legally binding, is different from like directives, the framework agreement. But we do have, especially from the OSH perspective, so health and safety at work, we have the general principle of prevention that should apply for every situation, where the employer, that has been said previously, has to assess the risk, having then preventive measures to mitigate or eliminate the risk with collective and then only individual measures. So that can be a good first way that to force or to incentivize the consultation, because there is an obligation to consultation of workers and representatives on all work change that will impact health and safety, including physical and mental. And then there is also, I want to point out, the Annex 1 of the directive on display screen equipment. And the Annex 1 say that you need to look at the display of the screen, keyboard, work desk, work chair, all these kind of things. So this is already in the regulation that applies to teleworkers and non-teleworkers. And there is already also a framework agreement with the idea of the right to disconnect that has been concluded in 2020, period of implementation 2023. So this is the moment to put that on the table as well.
So good. You have all this in mind. There's one thing very important for you and on the employees' point of view is that it's good to have a negotiation about telework, the way to do the telework and the days to do the telework, but there has to be a negotiation also about doing or not doing telework. And you really are affirmative on that, on the fact that we have to negotiate about telework, but also on the fact that if someone doesn't want to do it, he must have the right not to do it. And this is something important and doesn't have to be a new inequalities coming. How important that has to be in the current negotiations?
For me or Rebekah, do you want to answer this first?
Maybe Aude first and Rebekah then.
Okay, so, well, I think the voluntary aspect, this is what you ask, how it's important to put that on the table. Well, especially, I think, in teleworkable jobs and sectors where it wasn't the case before, that it's really important, once again, we have this discussion. And here, just a little caveat here. It's so important also to have legal rules to frame what are the topics that need to be discussed, to then empower workers in the conversation, but also secure employers that they know what they should discuss. This law here will be a safety net. And here, on top of that, then, indeed, I think the voluntary dimension is crucial, but in the sense of keeping quotas, for example. So if you say, let's have 10 days of telework possible for the workers as they want per month, that also is a compromise. It doesn't have to be 10 days, but a discussion on how do we manage to keep a link, how management feel comfortable with the situation, but how the workers can use it for the work-life balance with their private life. How they can also, it can be also an incentive in the green transition. Like telework can be such a powerful and beneficial things. So, and however, if people are working in small flats and don't feel comfortable at home and they want the social interaction, they are free to go. But this is an add-on that shouldn't be, and at any moment, no moment, we recommend 100% telework time, like it has been the case during the pandemic. It's always a question of compromise, of discussing with management to see how we find a solution that will suit both sides. But yeah, we cannot force someone to telework indeed.
Je voudrais, I would like to go to you, Rebekah, but not maybe with the same questions, but with the questions from the audience, and I will say it in French if it's possible. I know you speak good French. So, alors, en présentiel ou en distanciel, le dialogue social est le socle de la performance des entreprises. Comment faire prendre conscience aux
Social dialogue is the very basis for the performance of companies. How can we make sure that all the operators or the stakeholders be aware of that? How can we encourage companies and managers of these companies to consider this as an asset? It's also important to make sure in this negotiating process that employers be aware of the need of social dialogue in the framework of teleworking.
We fully agree with the trade unions. You know, telework has to be voluntary. That was a key principle in our 2002 agreement. And I think if we do manage to negotiate a new agreement on this, it would be, again, a key principle. And I think there's probably hardly any employer or worker that wants to be either 100% at work or 100% at home. And that's why we need to find this balance between the two. And it's in both interests of the employer and of the employees. And I think our role at a European level, from our point of view, is to set the framework, but to leave enough space for social partners at the national level, the sectoral level, and indeed the company level, because that's where they know their specific situation best, to leave them the necessary space to really devise the more specific rules. So we wouldn't see that as something we can do at the European level. Of course, we need a kind of set of framework rules, but we need to leave some space because each company, each sector, and even each country is different when it comes to, you know, how the industrial relation system works, for example. Then on the second question, that's not a very easy question either in English or in French, to be honest. I think if I understood correctly, that the question's about how do we encourage employers to be positive about the social dialogue, particularly in the area of telework, but more generally.
If I understand it clearly might be a bit of an interpretation from myself, and I'm sorry for that. It's how this negotiation is not just one more thing to assume for the employers, but something that might be also of his initiative, of a benefit for him, and not just one more rule, more regulation he has to apply and to go after, but something he can be really proactive on, as using it as a new tool of prevention, social dialogue, and not just something that he has to answer the employee's need about only.
Sure. I mean, this is how social dialogue should always work from our point of view. It can't be one or the other. Of course, if we're talking about social dialogue that leads to binding legal texts, of course, there's an element of providing rights to workers within that. But I think it's also, as any social dialogue solution, whether it's an autonomous agreement or legislation, it's about finding a balance between the needs of the employers. And that comes also from having a constructive attitude on both sides. That comes from allowing the space for social dialogue solutions that I was talking about, and allowing the space for specific measures to be taken in sectors and at a company level, so that it really meets the needs of the employees and the workers in those situations. So it's about having this constructive attitude and looking at the needs on both sides, and also, you know, more than anything, having a trust-based approach to negotiating. I think that's where we really get to good agreements, and I would hope that, you know, that's the spirit that we will go into in these forthcoming negotiations once, and if we have a mandate on both sides.
Good agreements is the issue that everyone can wish, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it's not happening actually. And when it's not happening, there might be another way, which is the regulation to define what is possible and not possible. We saw that in some countries, 8 countries, there is a law about the right to disconnect happening. So it can, and Katerina told us actually that it can also be linked to collective negotiation, but that it gives a global common standard. Actually, each of you, are you in favor at the moment for a directive, a European directive on this right to disconnect, to apply it in the countries where there's no specific law for it? Who wants to answer first?
Well, I can, if it's okay.
Aude and Rebekah.
Yes. First of all, in terms of the link with the directives or national legislation and social discussion and social dialogue, I really truly believe, and we have example, that having directive still allow freedom in the content of the discussion. It's just what should be discussed. Then the social partners have always and will remain free of the content of this discussion. And this is really important that we emphasize this. And I mean, the directive is only setting common aims and goals. I'm just emphasizing this. And so, yes, right to disconnect completely. I think it can be, once again, having one to ensure that everywhere it will be implemented, if there is a directive, with the respect to the national legislation and practices, so still the spirit of freedom on how you do it, but still being sure everybody have it in one way or another. But also, which is important, the right to disconnect should be put into the context of other risks, such as psychosocial risk and work organization. Not only the workers, it has been said before by a panelist, it's not only stating to the worker, you can disconnect, it's being sure it will be in the position that he can do it. It's to be sure that the workload is not too much, so he's in the position of really completely cutting off and not working on his own at home. This is, this is all this kind of things. It's not only on the worker then to transfer the responsibility to disconnect and be like, okay, you didn't disconnect, your fault. It's the work organization allowing the worker to do it. So it is bigger than this, but the directive completely, it can do the job.
Rebekah, what's your vision of this?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have to put this in a broader discussion. So, I mean, in a way, we already have a right to disconnect with the rules on working time, rules on rest period. So maybe what we need to look at is how to make that more, or better implemented, I would say. And I mean, this is part of the negotiations. If we get a mandate with our members, that we will be one of the issues that we'll be looking into. But where I do agree with Aude is we have to look also at the more structural issues. Why do workers feel or have to connect more? So this comes down to work organisation. It comes down to the relationship with management. It comes down to the relationship with colleagues. Because I think we have to bear in mind also that the burden of having to connect or having to answer emails, answer phone calls doesn't always come from the management. It can also come from, and often comes from, other colleagues. So it's also about the culture at the workplace. How do we make sure that there isn't a kind of out of hours work culture, which of course comes from managing the workload, the relationships at the workplace, and the kind of assumptions that they may be about working outside hours or not. And of course, not all these things are things that can be legislated from our point of view. They're things that come from the grassroots, from the workplace, from the company level. At the same time, I think we are now looking into this issue as a topic for our social partner negotiations, potentially with binding legislation. Of course, for us, it's important to make sure, again, that we have the balance between the needs of the workers and the employers, bearing in mind that a lot of workers now like this kind of flexibility, that workers that may want to go and do their shopping or go to the gym or pick up their kids or something in the middle of the afternoon and then work later in the evening. And of course, we have to be open to this flexibility and not put us in a kind of straitjacket, both the employer and the worker, because it's not really in either of our interests if we have very, very prescriptive rules and we move away from this growing need for flexibility and desire for flexibility from the workers and the employers.
In the very few minutes that we have still for the end of the debate, I would like to view with you, Aude, on how this pandemic, how this massification of telework emphasizes also the wish, the fight you have actually to install another directive on psychosocial risk, because we saw that psychosocial risks are really an important aspect of the risk, the occupational risk with telework. How this telework emphasizes for you the emergency to have this new directive?
Well, interestingly enough, I jump also and make the transition with what Rebekah said, because she mentioned workload, work organization, the question of the relationship with colleagues and management. This is psychosocial risk factors, and that indeed should be regulated, framed, prevented, and not only the work-related stress. And if we don't take care of this factor, that can lead also to workplace bullying. There is something that we need to discuss here. And what we see, and indeed that has been increased PSR factors like psychosocial risk have been a disaster in terms of telework during the pandemic, because it was, once again, full-time and there was the pandemic situation. But this is something that will remain as one of the major risks with musculoskeletal disorders and ergonomic risk for the telework and non-teleworkers. And what we see, it's like, first of all, that can be legislated, because we have example of legislation in multiple countries that have been doing so for decades of years. The most recent example is in Denmark with an executive order 2020 that literally look at the PSR factors while giving the freedom, once again, on the ground, in the company, on how you discuss that. It's providing a list of what should be assessed and discussed. And the problem is right now, we don't have a framework specific for PSR. We rely only on the general principle of prevention. And EN-4 by EUROGIP show that even if health and safety is assessed in a lot of companies in the European Union, the PSR factors, stress and workplace bullying, are not part of the list. This is not put on the table. And in many countries, having a legal requirement is a major incentive to discuss that, especially in health and safety. Once again, all we want here is discuss, agree with management, agree with employer what need to be discussed, providing safety, not only for the workers, but also for the employers, so they know what is expected from them in terms of psychosocial risks. So yes, this is the moment to talk about the directive on this.
Rebekah, in a really few words, what's your vision about this? Is this an opportunity to discuss the possibility of whether a directive or frame specifically done on this psychosocial risk?
So for us, we have a very different position on this to the trade unions. We don't believe that we need a specific directive in this area. We have the EU Health and Safety Framework Directive. I see what Aude is saying, that often in the risk assessment process, these issues aren't picked up on. But from our point of view, it doesn't make sense, or that isn't a reason to develop a specific directive, because what we don't like as employers is this trend to develop, and it's a trend that's been growing over the decades, even in health and safety legislation, to have hazard specific or risk specific directives, because you often get different requirements and risk assessment in these directives, and it creates a lot of confusion for employers. And what we would rather see is specific guidance on how do you apply the risk assessment within the framework directive to psychosocial risks at the workplace. I think the other issue that we have here is that when it comes to psychosocial risks, it's much more difficult to define what are the causal links with the workplace. Stress and psychosocial risks are apparent in our daily lives. So we need to make sure that there is a clear causal link to the workplace, and that's not always easy to prove. In fact, it's often very difficult to prove, because the causes can be outside the workplace, and in fact sometimes those problems are brought into the workplace as well, which has an effect on workers' performance. So it's a much more complex issue from our point of view, one that's much better tailored to guidance on how to apply the risk assessment procedure in this area. But where we do see a possibility to tackle this is in the revision. We will have probably a revision, or at least a review of the Workplaces Directive, and also the directive on display screen equipment. Of course, that's not the only source of stress and psychosocial risk, but it can be one. And so we do see some possibilities to maybe beef up the provisions on stress within these two directives, because we're revising them anyway in the coming years. So that's somewhere where we think we could discuss options with the trade unions. Of course, again, taking into account the balance of their priorities and ours.
So as a big agenda coming and many negotiations still on, which might be relayed in the next EUROGIP debate. So thanks to you too to have been with us, and so also avec beaucoup de ferveur, si je puis dire, parce que je n'ai pas toujours les mots en anglais, with a lot of passion actually on this.
You were pretty much enthusiastic.
Meet this afternoon for the pursuit of the debates. We will see how we can have innovations in this new hybrid work and enterprises, and how also the European strategy can give some perspective to this new form of work. It will be the continuation of what we just said. Thanks a lot. Have a good lunch and see you. It's 2:00 for the next step of our debates.